Hello and welcome to the ICVA Bitesize training for schemes and ICVs on vulnerability. My name's Sherry, I'm the Interim Chief Executive Officer for ICVA, and I'm really grateful to be speaking to you today on this really important topic. So firstly then, we'll take a look at our objectives for the session. We'll be discussing and examining definitions of vulnerability to see what there are in terms of what that might look like. We're going to give an overview of what constitutes vulnerability in police custody, and that will include some fairly detailed information from PACE Code C, which is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act Code C, which are the arrangements for detention. And we'll develop a further understanding of how to monitor the treatment of vulnerable detainees in police custody. So firstly then, what is vulnerability? Well, the Oxford Dictionary definition says that it's the state or quality of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. So that's quite a firm and yet slightly broad definition of vulnerability. So if someone feels that they may be attacked or harmed in any way, that can then render them vulnerable. So that's our dictionary definition of vulnerability. So what does PACE Code C say? Well, PACE Code C is what governs how people are treated, their rights and entitlements whilst in police custody, and it also includes definitions of vulnerability. And PACE Code C says, if at any time an officer has any reason to suspect that a person of any age may be vulnerable, with a paragraph there that we'll look at in a second, in the absence of clear evidence to dispel that suspicion, that person shall be treated as such for the purposes of this code. So it's a bit of a convoluted sentence, but really and truly, if an officer has a suspicion that anyone of any age is vulnerable, if there isn't information to prove that's not the case, then they must be treated as vulnerable. So who does vulnerability apply to in terms of PACE Code C? And it states that vulnerable applies to any person who, because of a mental health condition or mental disorder, so it notes that these might be people who may have difficulty in understanding or communicating effectively about the full implications of procedures and processes connected with their arrest and detention, their voluntary attendance at the police station or their presence elsewhere for the purposes of voluntary interview, and the exercise of their rights and entitlements. So there's several parts to the process that are mentioned there, and vulnerability then applies to anyone who isn't really understanding where they are in that process, what's happening to them, or they can't communicate effectively throughout that process and understanding the full implications of their arrest, detention, or voluntary interview, or they don't understand what their rights and entitlements are. All of those things may lead to a detainee engaging with 1.13d, which then would make them vulnerable. Vulnerability overall is quite a difficult term to define. I think it would be fair to say that people in all sectors for quite some considerable time, in terms of academics, practitioners, and a whole host of people, have endeavoured to define vulnerability, and I think vulnerability can mean different things in different settings. People use different definitions of vulnerability, but for the purposes of this training, we will primarily use the definitions from PACE Code C and one from HMIC FRS, which we'll go on to look at fairly shortly. So, vulnerable applies then to arrest, detention, voluntary attendance, and people who may have difficulty understanding their rights and entitlements. Who else does it apply to, or how else does it apply? Well, this term, again, from 113, applies to those who do not appear to understand the significance of what they're told, of questions they're asked, or of their replies. So if someone in custody, if you have a detainee in custody who doesn't really understand perhaps the gravity, if they've been arrested on a serious crime, or they're not quite grasping the questions they're being asked or why they're being asked, or the seriousness of of their current situation, then that fits into this definition of vulnerability. And there's a third part, which is that vulnerable also applies to any person who, and remember this ties on to because of a mental health condition or mental disorder, and that's PACE's words rather than ICVA's, but those people might be particularly prone to becoming confused or unclear about their position, providing unreliable, misleading, or incriminal information without knowing or wishing to do so, or readily agreeing to suggestions or proposals without any protest or question. And certainly there's some cases and case law in not too distant history where people with certain mental health conditions or certain neurodiversities will agree to things because they would like to please, agree to things because perhaps they don't understand quite the implications, and all of the things that we've discussed here. So those are covered under PACE. You will note at the start it also said that in PACE that you ought to have reference to note 1G. Well, note G's here, and I apologise in advance for reading this slide out to you. I'm sure you're all perfectly capable of reading it yourself, but it's quite a dense slide, so I think we'll go through it. And so 1G is an additional note. It's in PACE. There's explanatory notes all the way through PACE, and we have a briefing on what PACE is and what the APP is and what the contents are, which you might want to have a look at. It covers all of the sections of both of them and gives you a real indication of what you can find and where in PACE Code C and the Authorised Professional Practice, which is the guidance from the College of Policing, both of which are specific to detention. You might also come across PACE Code H, and PACE Code H is similar in content to PACE Code C, but it's specifically for those held in terrorism detention. And I shan't say too much about that here, but the broad contents of PACE Code C are the same as PACE Code H. So, note 1G then. A person may be vulnerable as a result of having a mental health condition or mental disorder. And you'll note that we saw that in the definition of vulnerability. So there were all of those circumstances that people might show vulnerable behaviours as part of a mental health condition or mental disorder. But importantly, note 1G goes on to say, similarly, simply because an individual does not have or is not known to have any such condition or disorder, it does not mean that they are not vulnerable for the purposes of this code. So that's a really important kind of point in note 1G, because the rest of the main body of the code is predicated on mental health conditions or mental disorders, but note 1G makes it very clear that actually in the absence of that information, a detainee can still be considered vulnerable. It goes on to state that therefore it's really important that the custody officer in the case of a detained person, or the officer investigating the offence in the case of a person who has not been arrested or detained as appropriate, considers on a case-by-case basis whether any of the factors described in paragraph 1.13d might apply to the person in question. So, albeit that those things might not be because of a predisposed mental health condition or known mental disorder, and again, I would like to reiterate that the terminology there is from PACE Code C rather than ICVA's own. But there is a clear guidance there for officers to consider on a vulnerability on a case-by-case basis, even in the absence of a diagnosis. I will just move my head out of your way by the magic of technology. So it then says, in doing so, the officer must take into account the particular circumstances of the individual and how the nature of the investigation might affect them, and bear in mind that juveniles, by virtue of their age, will always require an appropriate adult. So consequently, note 1G finishes up by kind of letting us know that juveniles are considered vulnerable by deem of their age, and I'm sure that's something that you're all perfectly aware of, but also just indicates again that it's a particular case-by-case examination of vulnerability, and that officers must take care to do that. And similarly, that would be as you would do in your role as an ICV. If someone hadn't necessarily been identified as vulnerable, but in your discussions with them you think, well, actually there's a communication barrier here, or there seems to be a lack of understanding of the process. That might be things that raise a flag that you might want to discuss and feedback with the custody staff, possibly recommending an appropriate adult be called to assist the detainee with the custody process. So as I mentioned, then the College of Policing has an authorised professional practice. So again, the briefing on PACE and APP kind of explains what both of them are. And I'd really recommend you take a read, not because it was written by me, but you might just want to take a read anyway. It's a useful document and has all of the links in it that you'll need to access the materials. And the College of Policing authorised professional practice for detention and custody says that vulnerability assessments should take account of the appearance and behaviour of the detainee, any signs of illness or injury, their style and level of communication, collaborative information from all sources, and the circumstances and environment in which they were found. So this could include all sorts of things, such as the detainee's personal presentation, how they're interacting with custody staff. It might be a desktop review of previous times in custody if that's relevant and they've been in before. It might include the gravity of the offence. There's a whole host of information there that custody staff will need to take into account when determining detainee vulnerability. And the APP goes on to say that forces might find it useful to refer to a vulnerability assessment tool as part of their training in decision making and personal safety. So there is a national decision making model which you can find on the College of Policing website in the APP. It's linked in the detention section, and part of that national decision making model is a vulnerability assessment framework, and we'll just have a quick look at what that looks like. So it's a fairly simple system to follow and remember because it's A, B, C, D, E. So A is appearance and atmosphere. So what you see first, including physical problems such as bleeding. So that might be how someone presents at the custody desk when the custody officers are booking them in. So behaviour, what are the individuals doing? Is it appropriate behaviour given the situation? And I think that's a really interesting point. One might expect detainees who are being booked in and brought into custody to experience heightened emotion, whether that be fear, whether that be vulnerability factors. Is it appropriate given the situation, or do you think it might possibly link to a vulnerability? And do the officers think that might be linked to a vulnerability? Communication, and I think communication is always really key. So it's not just about what people say, but it's how they say it. And also your communication to the detainee. Are they understanding what you're saying? Are they able to process it? Are they aware of what communications they've been given and understand them? Danger. So this one is whether the individuals are in danger and whether their actions put other people in danger. So in terms of custody, you might be looking at whether they're a risk to themselves. Are they vulnerable because they have previously self-harmed, are expressing self-harm ideations, or are they exhibiting violent and aggressive behaviours? So that's part of the vulnerability assessment framework. And the environment. So the environment, obviously, for our cause would be custody. So who else is in custody and what impact will their behaviours have on others and indeed their own health and safety? So the A, B, C, D, E: appearance, behaviour, communication, danger, environment. And officers are prompted to go through these things and make a determination of vulnerability for a detainee. And then they might want to set alternative arrangements for custody, distraction items. There might be observation levels set to help support detainees and manage their risk effectively. So HMIC FRS, which is Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, produced a thematic on vulnerability, and that states that their research, data analysis, and indeed their inspection reports show that many people taken into police custody are vulnerable in some way, and that police custody detention can be particularly detrimental to their welfare. And they go on to say that that vulnerability can take many forms, and that might include mental health problems, might include learning difficulties, physical illness or disability, alcohol and or substance misuse, and age. So as we said before, all children are vulnerable, and older people might be likely to be more vulnerable through illness, for example. And race. So people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities can be vulnerable because of their minority status. So this is the definition of vulnerability that ICVA use. It's really worth noting actually that these aren't siloed vulnerabilities, so it's not beyond the bounds of possibility by any means for someone to have a mental health condition and be a child, or for someone to be have alcohol misuse and also have a learning difficulty. So it's really important to note that people might have one or more vulnerabilities from this list. They're not mutually exclusive. So we're going to do a quick exercise now on the video. So I will show you the next slide, and then I'd like you to pause the video, please. So you will need a pen and paper. Pause now if you need to go and get one. And then we will move on to the exercise. So on this page then, there are several, there's the list of the HMIC FRS vulnerabilities. What I'm going to do is ask you to have a little think and just jot down some notes, please, of what are the potential impacts of those vulnerabilities on a detainee in custody? How might that affect them? So just think of some ways that, so for example, if someone in custody has mental health problems, what things might you want to consider? What risks are there? For learning difficulties, what things would you want to assure yourself as an ICV around their vulnerability, or in order to establish that whether they were vulnerable or indeed not? So just take a few moments, and I'll leave a little second for you to pause the video. Click pause now. Okay, so hopefully you had time to pause the video and have a little bit of a think about each of those vulnerabilities and how they may present in custody. And now I'll run you through a few examples of how we think those might come up. It's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure you've had some brilliant ideas that we haven't put on the next slide. And if that is the case, then maybe you could discuss them at a panel meeting or in your ICV pairs when you're going on visits, just to really kind of focus on this area of vulnerability and keep on that learning. So some of the examples then. So if someone in custody has mental health problems, there may be a risk of self-harm. There could be a presentation of low mood. Conversely, they could be very excitable. And do they understand the process? So there's some things there around mental health. It may, and for those detainees, you would want to make sure that there'd been an engagement with liaison on diversion or with the healthcare providers, and that custody staff were aware of your concerns. So for learning difficulties, if you have a detainee who might have a learning difficulty, then you'd want to make sure that they understand their rights. So does that detainee know what's happening, why they're there, and how they're going to be supported through the process? Does the detainee understand their rights? Are they frightened? It's quite an alien environment in custody. I know you've all probably been going in and out of custody for some time now and are fairly comfortable with the environment. But for someone who doesn't necessarily know the environment so well or has additional needs, it can be a really scary place. So check in with detainees as to if they present as being frightened. I would say that's an indicator of vulnerability. If a detainee has a physical illness or disability, then you might want to check on some of the more practical things that can support them. So are they able to get on and off the bed with ease? Are they able to use the toilet? Are there any other access needs or special diets? Are they presenting with pain? And then you can support any of those needs effectively and monitor that they've had the rights and entitlements that they need to be able to be in custody as comfortably as they can. Alcohol and substance misuse, so are they withdrawing? Healthcare have limited things that they can give in custody quite often, but they may well be able to support. And also there's a risk around people with withdrawing and physical health risks that come alongside withdrawal. So are they physically ill? Do they appear disordered in their thinking? If someone is withdrawing or is heavily intoxicated, then there may be problems there understanding the process and the gravity of what's happening. So for age, and as we've already said, all children are vulnerable. Older people may be more likely to be vulnerable through illness. Does the detainee understand why they're there and where they are? Do they understand their rights? Are they frightened? And sometimes I think it's worth remembering, and you may have seen this if you've looked at some of our children straight to ICV resources, children in custody, that frightened doesn't always look the same. So frightened doesn't always look like a child cowering in the back of the cell. Frightened can also look aggressive. Frightened can also look disordered. So there's different presentations there of fear, and it's worth being aware of those and kind of doing, in as much as you can during the time in your visit, that sort of holistic view of how the child or older person is if you consider them to be vulnerable. And for race, something to consider there is, are the custody staff interacting with the detainee well? Are there any signs that their treatment is different than others? And that might be in terms of how the detainee is referred to. It could be in terms of access to entitlements. So all of those things on that exercise are worth checking. And as I say, I'm sure you came up with many, many more. And please do continue to think and continue to share examples of vulnerability and where you might be able to share those with your scheme and your peers. The more we think about vulnerability, and the better, really, and continue our learning. So a very brief overview then, and again, a great deal of you will be well aware of this safeguard. You may have attended various other ICVA training on this matter, or the training from Cardiff University. But the AA is a statutory role established by PACE, which is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, and its Code of Practice, so Codes C and H, as we've discussed. And it's a framework that applies to police forces in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The role's origins lie in a miscarriage of justice in which 2 children and a young adult with learning disability were convicted of serious offences on the basis of false confessions. And you'll see the National Appropriate Adult Network there. There's lots more information on their website as to how AAs came about. There's lots of reports which deal extensively with vulnerability. And it would be a really good place to check out some further information. But we also have a briefing, which I will send out along with this, the link to this training, so you can do some more reading on that and how it's pertinent to the ICV role if you'd like. So the police are required then to contact an AA as soon as practicable whenever they detain in custody or voluntarily interview under caution a child or young person under the age of 18, so that's 17 or under, or an adult who's vulnerable. And we've quite extensively been through a definition of what that vulnerability could look like. So the activity of an AA then include, but by no means are limited to, helping people understand their rights, ensuring that they're protected. So someone might not always understand what they're allowed to have in terms of their rights. So it could be the telephone call to let someone know where they are. It could be their explaining that they have the right to a solicitor and that they have the right to change their mind. If they say no initially, they are able to change their mind at any time during the process and access legal advice. So they can support and advise whenever a detainee is provided or given information or participates in any PACE procedure. So that can go right the way through custody. It could, for example, explain, an AA might explain why samples are being taken. They might explain the solicitor thing. They can explain the interview process. And the AA can also assist with communication between the detainee and the police. And finally, on this point, that they can observe whether the police are acting properly and fairly and are respecting the rights of the young person or vulnerable adult, and inform the police if they're not. So it's a protection, it's an explaining and communication role, but it's also a really important safeguard the appropriate adult function in custody. So the role of ICVs in vulnerability in your visit then. So upon arrival in the suite, you should ask the custody sergeant or DDO, whoever welcomes you into the suite, about the number of people with suspected vulnerabilities in custody. So that might be children, it could possibly be women, it could possibly be under race, it could be people with mental health issues, and prioritise visits to those detainees. Whilst you're visiting, of course, you'd want to check on well-being and conditions, check that the detainee fully understands their rights and entitlements, check that the vulnerable detainee has an appropriate adult, and if they know what that role is, and if the appropriate adult is on their way, if they've already seen one. If you're able to see the custody record, then you can check that a vulnerability assessment has been undertaken, and what time an appropriate adult was called, and the rationale for not doing so if the custody staff have determined that the individual isn't vulnerable. There's a note there on assumed consent for if the detainee is incapable of consenting for any reason, which is from the ICVA Code of Practice, which is available on our website. So then you're finding out how many vulnerable detainees there are in custody at the time of your visit, you're prioritising them, you're checking on the conditions, you're checking on the safeguards, and you're following that up with a look at the custody record. And what sort of things might we think that you should be looking for and report on? Well, one of the things is that you are the eyes and ears of the public. You're providing public reassurance that detainees are being treated well. So do you feel that the detainee is vulnerable? What are your thoughts on that? If you think, actually, yeah, I do think this detainee is vulnerable, then it's really important that you record the nature of the suspected vulnerability or what the detainee has told you. Because it might be that the detainee hasn't told the custody staff something. Could be because they didn't engage, or they were in a different mindset when they came in. And actually, by the time you guys come along, they're a bit more happy to talk. Perhaps it's because you're not unified and you are members of the public. Could be any number of reasons why a detainee might disclose something to you, which perhaps they didn't at the original risk assessment and booking in phase. So make sure that you record that your concern and vulnerability and kind of what you think that might be. We're not expecting you to be clinicians, so we're not looking for a diagnosis of any kind of mental health condition or anything similar to that, but just make some notes on vulnerability around behaviour and communications if you have some concerns. And then, subject to the usual consent measures, as we mentioned earlier, check the custody record for a note on vulnerability. See if the custody staff have considered the detainee as vulnerable, and whether an AA provision was made, and time from request to attendance. And that can be really rich information to ensure that detainees spend the least possible time in custody and that they're supported effectively during that time. If the detainee states that they're vulnerable, or you're concerned that they're vulnerable, but they haven't been assessed as such, so you're doing your visit, you have some real concerns and think, oh, actually, I think this detainee has some vulnerabilities, make sure you raise that concern with custody staff at the time of your visit and ask them to re-engage with the detainee. You might say, you might suggest that an AA is an appropriate thing to do, but make sure that you make a note of that in your report and record the outcome. So if there isn't an initial record of vulnerability, but you're concerned, make your point to the custody staff and your feedback, and then ensure that it's recorded as well as any outcome on your report forms. So the kind of general ethos then of custody visiting and vulnerability is that those with vulnerabilities of any kind need care and attention. regardless of the behaviours. And again, we spoke about that a little earlier, saying, well, actually, fear doesn't always look like fear, and vulnerability doesn't always look like vulnerability. I think sometimes people expect vulnerability to look sort of cowed or along those lines, and actually that may well not be the case. People exhibit all kinds of behaviours for all kinds of vulnerabilities. So, and the general ethos is that everyone needs that care and attention in the custodial environment. As I said, you guys are volunteers. You're fantastic. You provide that community oversight and reassurance for the public. And we always say at ICVA that it's the friends and family test. So if you had a vulnerable relative or a friend, would you be happy if they were in that custody suite, and you'd be happy that they had appropriate safeguards and that they were being well looked after during their time in custody? And as always, if something feels wrong, report it. If something feels right and you think this is a fantastic job, report it. I think it's really important for custody visitors, and I'm sure you all do, but it's really important for independent custody visitors to raise concerns and be robust about those concerns, but also to applaud the custody staff when they're doing a fantastic job of looking after a vulnerable detainee well, and maybe varying their detention conditions, or using distraction items and things along those lines to assist the detainee through the custody process. So do make sure that you praise as well as praise and raise, I guess. So yeah, praise and raise. Okay, so to finish off this module then, there is you'll need to pause the video on the next slide because we've got a little quiz for you, and similarly to the exercise, there'll be a series of quiz questions. If you pause the video, I'll then let you know when you can then, and I'll give you a warning slide before the answers pop up just to make sure you've got time. So pen and paper at the ready, please. So quiz. Name 3 types of vulnerability someone in police custody could experience. Name 3 things an ICV should check if they suspect or have been told a detainee is vulnerable. Name 2 factors that would be assessed in a vulnerability assessment framework. And give 2 examples of where an AA would support a vulnerable detainee. So pause the video now and scribble down your answers. Okay, so I'm assuming you've taken us off pause. You have a sheet full of answers, and the answers are coming up now. So how did you do? Well, 3 types of vulnerability. So we've gone with the HMIC-FRS overview. So age, race, mental health, learning disability, alcohol or substance use, physical illness or disability. 1 point for each. So did you get your 3 points there? Name 3 things an ICV should check if they suspect or have been told if a detainee is vulnerable. So you want to check that the AA has been called, the vulnerability is recorded. You want to check the emotional state of the detainee, the custody record, and any reasonable adjustments for a physical vulnerability made. There might be other things there, so give yourself 1 point for everything you've managed to note there. 2 factors that could be assessed. So that was our A, B, C, D, E. So if you've remembered two or more of those, well done. Points for each. Sadly, we can't send out prizes, but points mean glory. And finally, on question 4, give 2 examples of where an AA would support a vulnerable detainee. So that's at any point of the PACE process, assist with comms between detainee and staff, help the detainee to fully understand the rights, observe police and ensure fairness. So there's lots of things. And again, you might have come up with others for that. But I'm sure you have all done incredibly well on the quiz. So we'll just revisit the objectives of this session then, just to recap. So we discussed and examined definitions of vulnerability. So we looked at in some detail for 1 and 2 as to what PACE Code C says, and that's fairly dense, but the explanatory note 1G is really, really key to then interpreting 1.13D. So do go back over that if you'd like to. And again, like I say, we have handouts that will come alongside this on what PACE and the APP is, if you'd like to do some further reading, and also one on the role of the AA with a checklist from the Cardiff University, ICVA, and the National Appropriate Adult Network. So there's some additional resources there. So hopefully we've discussed and examined definitions of vulnerability. We've given you an overview of what constitutes vulnerability in police custody from both PACE, APP and HMIC FRS, and further understanding and just exploring those issues around monitoring the treatment of vulnerable detainees and what sort of things you might look for. So that's the end of this bite-sized module. Please do check out the AA checklist and briefing, and I really hope you found the session useful. Many thanks indeed for your time. Take care.